Some jobs defy all reason. Paid to watch rats. Punished or paid to cry. Would you take this job?
In a dark stone corridor beneath the great halls of a medieval castle, a man crouched quietly, oil lamp in hand, eyes locked on a shadow darting near the pantry wall. He wasn't a soldier or a servant. He was a mouse watcher, paid to observe the movements of rats and record their paths. His notes helped the cooks decide where to store the grain and which walls needed sealing. In some towns, this was a full-time job, and in plague-ridden years it could mean the difference between life and death. Not strange enough. Then imagine another man seated beside a fresh corpse, slowly eating a loaf of bread and drinking a cup of ale left on the body's chest. He was called a sin-eater, believed to absorb the sins of the dead through this eerie ritual. The family paid him a few coins to carry away the soul's burden. No one dared speak to him afterward. In their eyes he had dined with darkness. When we think of the Middle Ages, we tend to picture knights in shining armour, noble kings in grand halls and peasants toiling in the fields. But beneath this familiar surface was a complex web of professions, many of which sound utterly bizarre to the modern ear. These weren't just oddities, they were essential cogs in a world with no electricity, no machines, and no modern sanitation. Every task, no matter how small or strange, had to be done by someone. This was a time when candles had to be certified for public use by men called candle viewers. Beer couldn't be sold unless it passed the taste test of an official ale taster. Need to dispose of human waste in a city without plumbing. That job went to the gong farmer who entered cesspits by torchlight and shovel. Even the task of simply ringing a bell on time was once a job of religious and civic importance, performed by dedicated bell ringers perched atop icy towers. Some of these jobs were born from necessity. Others grew from superstition, tradition, or fear. And many of them were dangerous, demeaning, or just downright disgusting. But they tell us something remarkable, that medieval life was deeply practical and often surprisingly creative in finding solutions to everyday problems. And those solutions, in the form of the strangest jobs ever imagined, kept the medieval world running. Over the next hour, we'll open the doors to a side of the medieval world that rarely makes it into history books. We won't just follow the kings and knights. We'll walk beside the men who cleaned up after battles, the women who whispered to the dying, and the children who were paid to be punished in place of princes. We'll look at how these strange professions were born, what they actually involved, and why some of them were respected while others were reviled. You'll meet the bell ringer who climbed narrow stone steps each night to toll out the hours, fire warnings and calls to prayer. You'll see the world through the eyes of a whipping boy beaten in the royal court for a prince's mistakes, because no one dared touch royal blood. And you'll stand at the edge of a bog with a leech collector who waded into mud with bare legs to supply doctors with their favourite medical tools. These were real people doing real jobs, often in the shadows of history. Some were forgotten. Others became legends whispered in guild halls and alleyways. But each played a role in shaping the world we've inherited. So stay curious, because this is more than a list of medieval oddities. It's a journey into how human beings, resourceful, scared, superstitious and ingenious, made a world work one weird job at a time. And our first stop, let's go. Meet the man who spent his nights chasing rats with a notebook and a candle.
A world moved by human hands.
Imagine waking up in a world where every task, no matter how small, must be done by hand. There are no engines to pump water, no elevators to lift goods, no machines to plough the earth. Everything from grinding grain to transporting timber relies on muscle, sweat and time. Even the act of lighting a fire could take 15 minutes of careful kindling and coaxing. In this medieval world, labour was not just a part of life, it was life. In towns and villages across Europe, people began working before sunrise, and often continued until the fading light forced them to stop. The rhythm of life was tied directly to the seasons, the harvest and the weather. Winter brought stillness, hardship and hunger. Summer brought opportunity, but also exhaustion. There were no labour-saving shortcuts. A full day's work meant aching limbs and dirt under the fingernails. In a society without automation, even the most basic actions required such effort that they naturally evolved into full-fledged professions. Grinding wheat into flour wasn't a quick kitchen chore. It was the work of the miller who managed giant millstones powered by rivers or wind. Hauling buckets of water became the responsibility of water carriers who moved back and forth between wells and homes day after day. Each task we now take for granted required a specialised role and often a strong back. Need firewood for the oven? That was the woodcutter's job. Need someone to skin and prepare a pig for winter? That was the butcher's skill. In the absence of machines, work became highly segmented, narrow specialised roles passed down through generations. Children often apprenticed from the age of 7, learning a single trade that they would carry into adulthood and teach to their own children. Work wasn't just about survival. It was an identity, a social status, a family legacy. The medieval world was a massive machine powered entirely by humans and animals. Oxen pulled carts along rutted roads, donkeys carried goods across narrow mountain passes, and men hoisted stones to build cathedrals by hand. Rope pulley and lever were the most advanced technologies of the time, and even those required strength and coordination to operate. There were no factories, no electric lights, no batteries, only torches, muscle, and the occasional gust of wind. And because every job demanded so much time and effort, people quickly learned that delegation was essential. That's how strange jobs emerged. Someone had to watch the fires all night, ring the bells on the hour, collect waste from the city streets, or keep pigeons from stealing the grain. These jobs may seem strange to us today, but in their time they made perfect sense. They were the small gears in a much larger clockwork, crude, creaky, but still ticking. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore just how creative, disturbing, and often bizarre some of these medieval roles became. But to understand why they existed at all, we must first accept this one truth: the Middle Ages ran entirely on people. In the medieval world, work was not just divided by skill, it was divided by class, birth, and divine order. The people of the Middle Ages believed society had been structured by God himself into what was known as the three orders: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. This wasn't just a metaphor, it was the actual blueprint of labour and daily life. At the top were the nobles, those who held land, collected taxes, and offered military service. At the bottom were the peasants, bound to the land, working from dawn until dusk for little more than survival. Nobles, despite popular belief, did not spend all their days feasting or fighting. Many were managers in their own right, overseeing estates, settling disputes, ensuring the smooth collection of grain and tithes. Their work was administrative, often delegated, but still critical. They employed stewards, bailiffs, and reeves to monitor labourers' record harvests and enforce laws on the manor. Though they rarely handled tools themselves, their role in the economy was that of landowner and legal authority. Their wealth flowed from the hands of the workers below them. Below the nobility stood the clergy, a separate and powerful class, whose duties revolved around prayer, ritual, record-keeping, and education. Monks copied books by hand, maintained herb gardens for medicine, and brewed ale within abbey walls. Priests conducted baptisms, marriages, and burials, spiritual acts that also held social and legal weight. Some clergy were deeply scholarly, fluent in Latin, and trained in philosophy. Others were more practical, managing land and people like any good landlord. Work within the church was viewed as sacred, even when it involved physical labour or complex administration. Then came the largest and most diverse class, the peasants. Contrary to the image of a single farmer, class peasants occupied many different roles and levels of freedom. Some were free tenants, renting their land and owing service or money to the lord. Others were serfs, legally bound to the land they tilled, unable to move without permission. These men and women worked as field labourers, ploughmen, shepherds, milkmaids, bakers, and smiths. Every job in the village had its place, and each household had to contribute its labour to survive. In return, they received protection, albeit limited from their lord. Yet even beneath the peasants, there were those who lived and worked without any freedom at all. Slavery, though diminished in many parts of Europe by the High Middle Ages, still existed in different forms. In the Mediterranean and eastern regions, slaves could be found in households' fields or even galleys. They were usually prisoners of war criminals or victims of long-distance trade. Unlike serfs, they had no legal status or protection. Their labour was total and unrelenting, and their presence reminds us that medieval society, for all its religious ideals, was not without cruelty. Work was therefore not simply what you did, but who you were. A noble's child would become a lord or lady. A peasant's child would work the fields like their parents. A monk's life was marked by hours of prayer and ritual structured as rigidly as a clock. Social mobility was rare, though not impossible. A skilled craftsman could sometimes rise through the ranks, join a guild, and earn wealth and influence. But for the vast majority, their job and their place in the world was fixed from the day they were born. This deeply stratified world created a rigid hierarchy of labour, but it also led to the rise of specialised professions within each class. Lords had scribes and falconers, monks had brewers and apothecaries, villages had millers, thatchers, tanners, and coopers. Each trade had its own traditions, tools, and secrets, and across towns and cities as commerce slowly grew, craftsmen began organising themselves into powerful guilds, laying the groundwork for the next phase of medieval labour skill-based identity. But even within this organised chaos, there were cracks jobs that didn't quite fit the structure. Roles that emerged out of necessity, superstition, or fear. They didn't belong to nobles or monks or standard village labourers. These were the ghostly professions, the marginal, the dirty, the strange. And in the next chapter we'll meet one of them, the man who was paid to watch rats in the castle pantry while everyone else slept. In medieval towns, skilled labour wasn't just valued, it was protected. Across Europe, tradesmen began forming powerful associations known as guilds, organisations that controlled who could practice a craft, how that craft was performed, and what standards had to be maintained. These guilds weren't merely social clubs, they were gatekeepers of knowledge, economic regulators, and political influencers. Whether you were a blacksmith, a baker, a weaver, or a mason, belonging to a guild gave your work legitimacy, and your family a sense of security. Without a guild's blessing, your trade might be deemed illegal, or worse, ignored entirely by customers. Guilds enforced strict rules on pricing, quality, and materials. A shoemaker couldn't sell cheap leather shoes undercutting everyone else. A brewer couldn't water down ale just to make an extra coin. In return, the guild protected its members, offering financial aid during illness, sponsoring festivals, and even covering funeral costs. These groups had their own symbols, patron saints and banners proudly displayed during public processions. Many had their own buildings and halls where disputes were settled, apprentices were tested, and secrets of the craft were passed down in hushed tones. To be in a guild was to be part of a respected lineage, but one didn't simply walk into a trade and declare themselves a craftsman. Most careers began with a child often as young as 7 becoming an apprentice. They would live with a master of the craft, not only learning the work, but also observing the routines, manners, and expectations of a proper tradesman. Apprentices worked long hours, usually unpaid, doing everything from running errands to preparing tools, all while absorbing the subtle skills that could not be taught from a book. After several years, and only with the master's approval, the apprentice could become a journeyman, free to earn wages and travel to other towns. But still not yet a master. The title of master craftsman was not given lightly. To earn it, a journeyman had to create a masterpiece, a flawless example of their work submitted to the guild for evaluation. If accepted, they were granted membership, allowed to open their own workshop, take apprentices, and add their voice to guild decisions. This process ensured not only technical quality but social continuity. In many towns, a guild had more power than the local lord or mayor, especially in matters of trade pricing and market regulation. The success of cities like Florence, Ghent, and London was built on the back of these structured artisan communities. Each guild had its own set of moral codes, not just for professional integrity, but for personal conduct. Cheating a customer, mistreating an apprentice, or violating religious obligations could result in fines, exile from the guild, or public punishment. And while the system was built on hierarchy, it also provided rare opportunities for upward mobility. A poor boy who became a talented goldsmith might rise to wealth and civic influence far beyond what his birth could have promised. In this way, the guilds acted as both protectors of tradition and quiet engines of change. But not every profession was welcomed into this structure. Many of the stranger or more marginal jobs, those dealing with death waste or superstition, stood outside the guild system. There were no formal associations for leech collectors, rat catchers or sin eaters. Their trades were too obscure, too dirty, or too feared to warrant organised recognition, and so while the guilds offered stability and prestige to the centre of society, they also left space for something else to grow at the edges, those strange solitary professions that history almost forgot. And that's where we're going next. Into the alleys, towers and cellars of the medieval world where odd jobs flourished in the shadows. Our journey begins with one of the strangest, a man who stayed up all night not to guard the gates or tend to the sick, but to follow rats. The absence of machines in the medieval world didn't just make life harder, it made it stranger. Tasks that today require the press of a button or the turn of a switch once demanded full-time human labour. Because nothing could be automated, medieval society responded with creativity delegation and sometimes pure desperation. Where a single engine might do the work of 10 men today, entire professions once existed to perform that function manually. And as life became more complex, so too did the jobs people invented to keep it running, even when those jobs made little sense to outsiders. For instance, keeping a church's massive bells ringing wasn't as simple as pulling a rope. It required timing, strength, and often someone to live in the bell tower year-round, braving the cold, and storms to toll the hours and warn of danger. In towns with large food stores, someone had to physically guard against rodents not by placing traps, but by watching, recording and reporting mouse activity every night. Without refrigeration, someone might be hired solely to salt meat or stir vats of boiling vinegar to prevent spoilage. Without clocks, it became someone's duty to mark the passing of time by candle-length water drips or sunrise chants. These jobs weren't optional, they were how things worked. The weirder the need, the weirder the job. And in a world where illness was misunderstood, death was constant and superstition ruled daily choices. Some professions emerged that defy logic by modern standards. People were paid to absorb the sins of the dead, to collect bloodletting tools, or to wade into swamps barefoot to catch leeches. There were even official tasters hired not for royal feasts, but to ensure common beer met local standards, a public health role long before germ theory. These weren't side hustles, they were jobs with titles, reputations, and in some cases terrifying risks. Now that we understand how the lack of machines shaped every aspect of labour, it's time to step into the margins, into the candlelit, foul-smelling corners of medieval life. In the next chapter, we'll meet the people whose jobs were so specific, so unpleasant, or so bizarre that they seem almost fictional. But they were very real, and our journey begins with one such figure, the man who was paid to follow rats.
Some watched rats for a living.
In a time before sanitation, pest control, or a scientific understanding of disease, rats were more than a nuisance, they were a threat to survival. In medieval Europe, rats infested barns, granaries, homes, castles, and even churches, chewing through sacks of grain, contaminating food supplies, and spreading fleas that carried deadly diseases. People didn't know about bacteria or viruses, but they understood the consequences of a rat problem all too well. A single infestation could ruin a harvest or trigger an outbreak of plague. So naturally, an entire profession emerged to confront this silent, skittering enemy, the rat catcher. Rat catchers were often feared, half respected, and largely left alone. They worked in filthy environments, crawling through sewers, basements, and stables, armed with nothing more than sack sticks poison, and sometimes even trained animals like ferrets or small terriers. They used traps made from wood and wire, baited with stale bread or salted meat. When poison was available, it often included deadly herbs like hemlock or arsenic, but dosage was imprecise, and the risk of harming children or livestock was always present. The rat catcher's job was considered vital during times of plague, and some cities paid them a bounty per rat tail presented. But in quieter times they were barely tolerated. These men often carried the stigma of filth with them, both literally and socially. They smelled of rot and smoke, and their clothing was usually worn and soiled. They worked alone, spoke little, and were rarely invited into taverns or markets. But despite their reputation, they were sometimes the first line of defense during outbreaks of disease. In times of crisis, the same people who had crossed the street to avoid a rat catcher would now offer him coins, food, or even prayer in exchange for his services. He was in a sense an exorcist, not of demons, but of vermin, and the fear they represented. Yet in larger estates and castles, where cleanliness meant status and reputation, a new role developed, one that seemed less dirty but equally strange: the mouse watcher. Employed in kitchens, storerooms, or grain silos, mouse watchers didn't trap or kill rodents. Their job was far more subtle. They stayed up at night with a lamp or candle, watching silently, recording mouse activity on parchment, and noting exactly where and when the creatures appeared. Over time, their notes helped identify infestation patterns, allowing the staff to seal cracks in the walls or move food storage areas accordingly. It was a low-risk, low-pay and incredibly dull job, but it served an important function. Mouse watchers were often young boys, elderly men, or servants considered unfit for harder labour. Sometimes they were former rat catchers who had grown too old to chase or kill. Their work required patience, quiet, and an unusual tolerance for solitude. They had to remain still for hours, listening to the faint scratching of claws on stone or the rustle of sacks in the dark. If they fell asleep or missed an important sighting, they might be punished or dismissed. Though the job sounds absurd today, in a time before traps or exterminators, this passive form of surveillance was considered practical and intelligent. In some monasteries, the task of mouse-watching even fell to scribes who would alternate between copying texts and monitoring the corners of the library to protect precious parchment. Rats and mice loved to chew on book bindings, especially those made from animal glue and leather. In royal kitchens, records survive of designated watchers being paid in bread and ale, their observations used to reorganize supply storage or identify entry points. These men were not warriors or scholars, but in their quiet way they helped protect the lifeblood of any estate, its food. Both rat catchers and mouse watchers highlight a strange truth about the medieval world. When technology doesn't exist, time and labour fill the gap. Where we might set a trap or install a sensor today, they had to rely on human eyes, ears, and hands. The result was a profession that combined physical endurance, tolerance for disgust, and a strange sort of quiet vigilance. These jobs were not glamorous. They offered no honour or wealth. But without them, households and entire towns would have suffered from starvation, infestation, and disease. In the grand hierarchy of medieval labour, these workers were near the bottom, unseen, uncelebrated, and often unwanted. Yet their presence tells us something important, that no society, however noble or holy, can function without someone doing the dirty work. Rat catchers and mouse watchers were the guardians of granaries and silent sentinels of survival, and as we'll see in the next section, they were far from the only ones to hold such peculiar positions. In fact, things are about to get even stranger. Because now we turn to the men who descended into the earth not to find gold or silver, but to shovel what no one else dared to touch. At the bottom of medieval society, both literally and figuratively worked the gong farmers' men, whose job was to climb into cesspits and remove human waste by hand. The word gong comes from the Old English gang meaning to go, and gong was a polite term for excrement. These workers were known by many names across Europe: vidangeurs in France, scavengers in English records, and nightmen in later periods. But whatever the title, their job was always the same: cleaning out latrines, privies, and cesspools that had become full of the collective waste of entire neighbourhoods. In cities with growing populations and no sewage systems, this was not just necessary, it was a matter of survival. Gong farmers worked almost exclusively at night. The smell, the health risks, and the social stigma were too great to permit such labour during the day. Armed with long-handled buckets, wooden shovels, and thick gloves when available, they descended into stone or wooden cesspits beneath castles, inns, monasteries, and private homes. Some pits were so deep that ladders were required, while others had only narrow tunnels through which the workers had to crawl. They scooped the waste into barrels, which were then hauled by cart to designated dumping grounds, usually outside the city walls. There the waste might be buried, burned, or used as fertiliser, depending on local customs and the type of waste. Despite the horrific nature of the work, gong farmers were often paid surprisingly well. Because few people dared to do what they did, their services were in high demand. A skilled gong farmer could earn more in a night than a common labourer might earn in a week. Some city councils offered contracts to gong farming teams, and official records show that even monasteries and noble households maintained annual budgets for waste removal. Payment wasn't always in coin. It might be in food, cloth, lodging, or even tax exemptions. In rare cases, the job was passed down through generations, forming small, tight-knit families of professional waste handlers. But with the pay came enormous risks. The air inside a cesspit could be toxic, filled with methane and ammonia. In some cases, men died from suffocation or collapsed due to the fumes before they could climb back out. Others drowned in the sludge, particularly if they lost their footing, or if the structure of the pit was unstable. There were also constant health hazards from cuts, infections, and parasites. Protective clothing was minimal, and no amount of washing could truly remove the smell from skin and hair. Many gong farmers lived in the outskirts of town, isolated from others, shunned despite the critical nature of their work. Socially, they were treated with contempt. People would cross the street to avoid them. Children were told not to speak their names aloud, and servants were warned never to let them enter the main halls. In religious circles, some clergy believed that the nature of their work made them spiritually impure, and yet without them, even the grandest cities would have collapsed into disease and decay. During outbreaks of plague or dysentery, cities that failed to maintain regular waste removal suffered the most. Gong farmers may have been invisible, but they were essential guardians of urban health. In London, records from the 14th and 15th centuries describe entire teams of gong farmers contracted by the city to clean public and private cesspits on a schedule. Their work was so important that it was regulated by law. They had to dump waste in approved areas only, and were prohibited from working near food markets or during religious festivals. In return, they were protected from harassment and allowed access to parts of town that others were barred from entering at night. They worked in silence, often with a look of grim determination. Their carts, covered with tarps or soaked in vinegar, rolled through the cobbled streets while the rest of the city slept. One might think that such a job would leave a man broken, ashamed, or anonymous, but that wasn't always the case. Some gong farmers took pride in their reliability. They viewed their task as necessary, honest work done for the good of the community. In some towns, they were even given ceremonial recognition during spring cleanings, or city fairs, moments when the population briefly remembered just how much they owed to those who worked in darkness. Of course, that respect was fleeting. Once the celebration ended, the gong farmer returned to his lonely, reeking labour. What makes this profession especially fascinating is how it exposes the contradiction at the heart of medieval society. A world obsessed with spiritual purity and social hierarchy still relied on men crawling through human waste just to keep its streets livable. The people who were most despised were also the ones who prevented catastrophe. They lived between the cracks, unseen but indispensable, covered in filth, but doing work no nobleman or priest would dare to touch. Their tools were crude, their labour dangerous, and their reward uncertain, but in the eyes of history they deserve a kind of dark honour. Today we flush and forget. But in the Middle Ages someone had to physically remove the filth, and that someone had a name, a skill and a job title. The gong farmer may have been shunned, but he was a professional in every sense. And just as with rat catchers and mouse watchers, his role reminds us that progress is built not only by kings and scholars, but by those who carry the burdens no one else will. In the next section we'll meet another such figure, a man who dove into swamps bleeding and barefoot to gather living tools for medieval medicine leeches. In the shadowy marshes and shallow riverbanks of medieval Europe, there worked a figure whose profession was as painful as it was peculiar, the leech collector. These individuals were tasked with gathering live leeches, small blood-sucking creatures prized by medieval medicine as miraculous tools for healing. Doctors believed that many illnesses stemmed from an imbalance of bodily fluids, or humours, and that bleeding a patient could restore harmony. Leeches were seen as the perfect method, natural, precise, and clean by medieval standards. But someone had to collect them, and that meant stepping barefoot into muddy, parasite-filled waters. Leech collectors didn't use nets or traps. The most effective method was the most brutal. They waded into stagnant ponds or slow-moving streams, often barefoot and with bare legs, and let the leeches latch onto their skin. Once a few had attached themselves and begun to feed, the collectors would gently remove them and place them into jars or sacks. This was repeated over and over until the day's quota was filled. It wasn't uncommon for a collector to return home bleeding from dozens of tiny wounds. The work was slow, agonizing, and constant leeches were always in demand. Most leech collectors were poor, landless peasants, widows, or itinerant workers with no other means of income. In some areas, women were the primary leech collectors, especially in regions like Wales and parts of Ireland, where folk knowledge of healing ran deep. Their feet and legs bore the scars of hundreds of bites. Repeated exposure to leech saliva, which thins the blood, meant that some collectors developed chronic bleeding issues. Infection, anemia, and exhaustion were constant threats. Yet for all its danger, leech collecting provided a rare opportunity, steady income from a market that never dried up. Doctors, barbers, and monks all relied on leeches for bloodletting procedures. In monasteries, jars of leeches were kept beside vials of herbs and manuscripts of healing chants. In cities, barber surgeons placed them beside their razors and tooth-extracting pliers. Even nobles demanded leeches for their personal physicians, believing them to be symbols of sophistication and care. As a result, the price of a healthy, plump leech could be surprisingly high. Some leech collectors struck deals directly with hospitals or apothecaries, supplying them on a regular basis. Others sold their catches in open-air markets where live leeches were weighed and priced like fish or flour. But catching leeches wasn't just about supply, it also involved deep local knowledge. A good collector knew where the best pools were, when to search, and how long to stay submerged before it became dangerous. They studied the water, the temperature, and even the presence of birds or frogs which could indicate whether leeches were nearby. In some villages, leech collection became a seasonal ritual passed down through generations. There were even superstitions and prayers offered before entering the water, hoping for both a full harvest and a safe return. It was a strange combination of biology, folklore, and necessity. The work, though vital, earned collectors little respect. Many were regarded with suspicion, especially those who dealt in large quantities or who travelled from town to town. They were seen as dirty, potentially cursed, and always bleeding. Children were warned not to play near the leech ponds, and some collectors were accused of witchcraft or poisoning wells. It didn't help that they often carried sacks squirming with blood-filled creatures, a sight that unsettled even the most hardened market-goers. Despite their important role in medicine, they were rarely thanked, only tolerated. Yet without them, an entire branch of medieval healthcare would have collapsed. Leeches were used for treating everything from headaches to fevers to melancholy of the womb. They were placed on the temples, the neck, even inside the mouth. Surgeons used them after amputations to reduce swelling, and monks applied them during rituals of purification. In a world where germs were unknown and fevers were feared as divine punishment, the leech was a gift from nature so long as someone else was willing to suffer to collect it. That someone stood knee-deep in the mud offering their blood in quiet daily sacrifice. Some of the only surviving records of leech collectors come from hospital ledgers, tax rolls, and court documents. A few even appear in medical manuscripts depicted as ragged figures holding jars of squirming black worms. Their names are mostly lost, but their work lives on in the legends of rural medicine and the foundations of medieval science. As late as the 18th century, long after the medieval period had faded, leech collectors still haunted the same bogs and rivers, keeping alive a profession rooted in blood and belief. They are among the forgotten workers of history who endured pain so others might hope for healing. As we move forward in our journey through the strangest jobs of the Middle Ages, the pattern becomes clear. In a world without machines, the human body became the most versatile tool. Whether crawling through cesspits or wading through swamps, someone was always there to do the work no one else dared to touch. And now, we turn to one of the most haunting roles of all, a solitary figure hired not to heal the sick or feed the poor, but to eat the sins of the dead. Among the most chilling and mysterious figures in medieval life was the Sin Eater, a person hired to consume food and drink left on the body of the recently deceased in the belief that doing so would absorb the soul's remaining sins. This strange ritual arose from a mix of religious fear, folk tradition, and the deep human need to explain what happens after death. Though not sanctioned by the church, it was practiced in quiet corners of Britain, Wales, and the borderlands for centuries. When a loved one died, a family might prepare a meal, place it on the chest of the corpse, and call in the Sin Eater to perform a grim and silent task. For a few coins, or sometimes only a crust of bread and mug of ale, they would take on the spiritual burdens of the dead. The act itself was simple but laden with meaning. The sin-eater would arrive at the house often after sunset wearing tattered clothes and carrying little more than a walking stick or sack. He would sit beside the body, close his eyes, and slowly eat the food laid upon it, often in complete silence. No prayers were spoken, no thanks were offered. The family would watch in uneasy quiet, some looking away, others whispering prayers under their breath. Once the food was consumed, it was believed that the sins of the deceased had passed from the soul into the sin-eater, freeing the dead for their journey into the afterlife. But this freedom came at a price not for the family but for the one who consumed the sins. Sin-eaters were treated as spiritual outcasts, believed to carry the guilt, shame and damnation of dozens, perhaps hundreds of souls. People avoided touching them, speaking to them, or even making eye contact. They lived alone on the edges of villages in huts near forests or moors, surviving on scraps and rarely welcomed at feasts or festivals. Some were never baptized. Others were former beggars, alcoholics, or those marked as unclean by the community. And yet when death came, they were always summoned discreetly but without fail. The psychological burden of this job must have been immense. Though they likely didn't understand the theological details, sin-eaters internalized the belief that they were absorbing real spiritual weight. Some came to believe they were cursed, haunted by the dead, stalked by visions, or destined for hell themselves. There are reports centuries later of sin-eaters breaking down in tears or refusing food that hadn't been blessed clean. In some folk tales they are portrayed as half saints, half demons, both feared and pitied. Their role walked a tightrope between superstition and spiritual desperation. Interestingly, the church strongly disapproved of this practice. It was seen as heretical, undermining the need for confession absolution and the authority of clergy. Priests condemned families who hired sin-eaters, and in some areas local bishops tried to outlaw the custom altogether. But in isolated communities far from the control of cathedrals, the practice continued quietly, privately, and often in secret. People feared death more than excommunication. If hiring a sin-eater gave a grieving family a sliver of peace, they would do it even if it meant breaking doctrine. Not all sin-eaters were men. In certain traditions, especially in rural Wales and Scotland, elderly women were known to perform the ritual. These women, often midwives or herbalists, were already deeply entwined with life and death. They helped bring babies into the world and guide the dying out of it. For them, consuming the sins of the dead was simply one more passage in a lifetime of crossing thresholds. They too were marginalized, often feared as witches or branded as unclean. Yet when death knocked, the village still came to their door. The food itself was symbolic. Bread was the most common offering representing the body of Christ in Christian theology. Ale or wine might accompany it, recalling the blood. Sometimes meat or cheese was added depending on local custom and wealth. In rare cases, coins were placed under the plate payment for sins, not with prayer but with silver. The meal was both sacrament and transaction. It existed outside the church, outside the law, but deeply inside the soul of the people. It was a ritual of hope wrapped in fear, a desperate attempt to save someone who could no longer save themselves. With time, as Protestant reforms, scientific understanding and modern funeral practices took hold, the sin-eater faded from daily life. But echoes of them remain. In poems, ghost stories and regional legends, they linger like shadows on the edge of memory. Their lives were marked by silence and stigma, but their role tells us something profound about the medieval psyche. That even in a world guided by religious authority, people still reached for personal folk solutions to unanswerable questions. And sometimes they paid someone to carry the weight they couldn't bear themselves. As we close this chapter on the strange and often sorrowful work of the sin-eater, our journey through bizarre medieval jobs is far from over. In the next section, we'll climb high into the cold towers of stone cities to meet the lone figure who spent his life ringing bells, not just to mark the hour, but to keep darkness at bay.
Strange hands kept life moving.
High above the muddy streets and timbered rooftops of medieval towns alone in the wind and stone lived the bell ringer, a solitary figure whose life was marked by rhythm, ritual and responsibility. Perched in church towers, castle turrets and city gates, these men served as the living clocks of their time. Long before mechanical timepieces were common, the bell ringer marked the hours, the workday, the call to worship, and the warnings of fire or invasion. His hands held the rope that kept society in sync, and with every toll he reminded the town below that time was moving and that someone was always watching. The job may sound simple, just pull a rope and let the bell ring, but in reality it was a test of endurance. Medieval bells were enormous, cast from solid bronze, often weighing hundreds, or even thousands of pounds. Ringing them required precise timing, physical strength, and often teamwork when multiple bells were involved. The bell ringer had to climb narrow winding staircases multiple times a day, even in storms, snow, or freezing fog. Once at the top, he braced his body, pulled with all his might, and guided the great swinging mass above his head. A misstep could lead to broken fingers or worse, being flung across the tower. The sound of the bell wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. It was believed that bells could ward off evil spirits, frighten away storms, or send prayers to heaven. During times of plague, bells rang more often tolling for the dead, warning of infection, or pleading for divine mercy. In some regions, a specific passing bell was rung when someone was dying to remind the faithful to pray for their soul. The bell ringer then wasn't merely a timekeeper, he was a guardian between the physical and spiritual realms, his labour wrapped in mystery and faith. He worked in silence, save for the thunderous voice of the bell itself. Bell ringers lived in strange isolation. In many towns they resided in rooms near or inside the bell tower, cut off from daily village life. The tower was cold in winter, stifling in summer, and often infested with pigeons and bats. Yet the bell ringer stayed faithful to the schedule marking time with a devotion that bordered on monastic. Meals were sometimes hoisted up to him in baskets, and he might go days without speaking to anyone face to face. But he knew his role mattered. Without his tolls, the market would not open, the workday would not end, and the dead would not be mourned. In larger cities, bell ringers worked in teams and followed strict protocols. A double ring might signal a fire. A slow, heavy toll could mean a noble death or public execution. On feast days, bells were rung in elaborate sequences for hours, echoing across fields and forests. The community relied on this soundscape like a medieval version of public broadcasting. In some places, bell ringing became a competitive art, with guilds of bell ringers forming to train in technique and physical discipline. Their coordination was legendary, especially when managing a dozen bells or more in complex patterns known as changes. But not all bell ringers were respected. Some were seen as eccentrics or half-mad hermits, their isolation feeding rumours and superstition. There were tales of bell ringers who went blind from staring at lightning through tower slits, or who died suddenly while ringing the bells during storms. In some stories, their ghosts lingered in the towers they once tended forever, tolling the hour for no one. Whether feared, revered, or forgotten, the bell ringer's life was one of devotion without glory. He was heard by all, seen by few, and understood by almost no one. Yet the role endures even now. In modern Europe, bell towers still exist, and though many are automated, there are still communities where men and women climb the stairs and pull the ropes just as they did centuries ago. Some do it as heritage, others as a sacred duty. Their hands grip the same ropes, their feet tread the same stone steps, their lives briefly echoing those of their medieval predecessors. Every toll is a reminder that time moves forward, that someone still cares enough to mark it, and that in the distant sound of a bell there's still something human calling out. As we leave the heights of the bell tower, we descend once again into the earth, not into filth or mud this time, but into silence. In the next section we meet the men who worked in graveyards under the cover of darkness, not to bury the dead, but to steal them. In the cold, damp graveyards of medieval and early modern Europe, a secret profession took root, one that existed in the margins of law, science, and morality. These were the resurrectionist men who prowled cemeteries by night, with shovels, sacks, and silence hired not by criminals, but by physicians, surgeons, and medical students in desperate need of cadavers. In an age when dissection was rare, controversial, and often illegal, the demand for fresh human bodies far outpaced the legal supply. And so the dead were stolen not for theft or desecration, but for knowledge. The resurrectionists became a shadowy middleman between the grave and the anatomy table. Their work was methodical and efficient. A resurrectionist would first identify a recent burial, ideally someone freshly interred, preferably in a shallow grave, and without a protective coffin or heavy stone slab. Sometimes they bribed local sextons or undertakers for information on ideal targets. Then, under cover of night, often during storms to muffle sound, they would dig with terrifying speed, working in teams, sometimes finishing in under 30 minutes. Their goal wasn't to rob the body of valuables, they weren't grave robbers in the usual sense, but to extract the corpse intact. Clothing was often discarded, jewellery ignored. The body itself was the prize. Once unearthed, the corpse was wrapped in canvas or stuffed into a long sack known as a resurrection bag. Transportation was equally discreet handcarts covered in hay wagons with hidden compartments, or coffins with false bottoms. In some cities, bodies were even floated downriver under cover of darkness, destined for universities and hospitals. Medical schools in places like Edinburgh, Bologna and London were infamous for their reliance on such illicit supply lines. Professors might turn a blind eye, students might pay directly, and institutions often maintained quiet arrangements with known resurrectionist gangs. The entire system was illegal, but necessary. Why all this secrecy? Because the church, the state, and the general public viewed the human body as sacred even in death. To disturb a corpse was to risk excommunication, imprisonment, or mob violence. Families feared not only spiritual consequences but practical ones. Many believed that a body needed to be intact for resurrection at the Last Judgment. The idea that their loved ones might be dug up and sliced open horrified them. As a result, some began burying their dead in iron cages called mort safes, or hired night watchmen to guard fresh graves for weeks after burial. In some towns, grieving relatives even took shifts watching over tombs themselves. But science marched on. The rise of medical knowledge in the late medieval and Renaissance periods demanded deeper understanding of anatomy, illness and surgery. And to study the body, you needed a body. Legal dissections were rare, usually limited to executed criminals, and were often politically motivated. This limited supply created an underground market, one that resurrectionists eagerly filled. Some were former criminals. Others were simply desperate men, poor and willing to risk prison, or a beating for a handful of coins. A few were even medical students themselves, grave robbers by night, scholars by day. The work was gruesome. Corpses were heavy and decomposition began quickly, especially in warmer months. Resurrectionists had to work, fast endure the smell and steel themselves against fear and revulsion. Some grew numb over time. Others coped with drink superstition or dark humour. They gave nicknames to the body's stiff's clients or cold ones, and referred to graveyards as gardens and coffins as packages. Their language was coded, their faces rarely remembered, but their impact was enormous. Behind nearly every advance in surgical training during the period, there was a stolen body. Occasionally resurrectionists were caught. When they were, the punishment varied. In some places they were jailed or flogged. In others, public outrage led to violent reprisals. Some were chased through the streets, beaten by angry mobs, or forced to flee towns entirely. Authorities were often conflicted. Technically, the crime was real, but the need behind it was undeniable. Some lawmen turned a blind eye if the graves weren't high profile. Others cracked down, issuing rewards for arrests and increasing graveyard patrols. It became a cat-and-mouse game, one where knowledge was the prize and morality the cost. Over time, public backlash forced change. In the 18th and 19th centuries, laws began to shift, especially in Britain and France, allowing for more legal donation of bodies to science, often from workhouses, unclaimed paupers, or the imprisoned. But in the medieval period and long after, the resurrectionists remained a necessary evil. They were never officially acknowledged, never thanked, and certainly never celebrated. But without them, generations of doctors would have learned surgery from books alone, never touching real flesh until it was too late. The line between healer and criminal blurred in the moonlit soil of every disturbed grave. Perhaps the strangest part of this story is how normal it became. Communities knew it happened. Doctors knew where the bodies came from. Even students in hushed whispers joked about ordering their next subject. And yet no one spoke of it publicly. It was a system of denial, a quiet agreement that the dead would serve the living one last time whether they wanted to or not. The resurrectionist shovel in hand was the final uninvited guest at every funeral. As we leave the graveyards behind and return to the living, our next destination takes us into the twisted logic of court life. In the next section, we'll meet a boy who was hired not to learn or to serve, but to be punished. Not for his own mistakes, but for those of a prince. In the glittering courts of medieval and early modern Europe, where royal blood was believed to be sacred and untouchable discipline, took on a strange and unsettling form. When young princes misbehaved, refusing their lessons, speaking out of turn, or disobeying their tutors, they could not be punished directly. To strike a future king was unthinkable, a sacrilege that could cost a servant his post or worse. But royal children were still children, mischievous, stubborn, and in need of guidance. And so a solution emerged from the twisted logic of divine hierarchy, the creation of the whipping boy. The whipping boy was a carefully chosen companion to the prince, often of noble but lower birth, raised alongside him in the royal household. He was educated, well-dressed, and taught the same lessons as the young royal, but his purpose was not academic. His presence served as a moral mirror. When the prince failed in duty or behaviour, the whipping boy was punished in his place. The idea was simple and brutal. The prince, bound by friendship or empathy, would feel remorse at seeing his friends suffer, and correct his own behaviour accordingly. Pain by proxy would teach responsibility, but this arrangement placed the whipping boy in a cruel and conflicted position. He lived in luxury close to power, but could be beaten at any moment for offences he did not commit. In some cases, the boys did form close bonds, friendships forged in forced proximity and emotional manipulation. In others, resentment festered. A prince might enjoy the spectacle or feel nothing at all. Meanwhile, the whipping boy had to remain obedient, accepting punishment with grace, knowing that defiance could mean dismissal or disgrace for his entire family. He was both courtier and scapegoat, present necessary and entirely expendable. Historical records of whipping boys are scattered and sometimes romanticised, especially in later literature. The practice is most famously associated with 16th and 17th century England, though it likely existed in other monarchies under different names or less formal arrangements. King Charles III of England reportedly had a whipping boy named William Murray, who later became a trusted nobleman. Whether the system worked as intended is hard to say. Some tutors believed it bred compassion, others said it taught princes to avoid responsibility altogether. What's clear is that the existence of such a role reveals the contradictions at the heart of royal upbringing. The concept of the whipping boy vanished as views on monarchy education and childhood evolved. Today it seems absurd punishing one person for another's mistakes, especially under the guise of moral instruction. Yet in its time it was seen as a logical extension of divine right and inherited privilege. Kings were born, not made, and to raise one properly, society believed even cruelty could be sanctified. The whipping boy suffered so that the crown might one day rule wisely. In that sense, he was a sacrifice not just of body, but of fairness itself. As we move onward, we descend once more not into sorrow, but into performance. In the next section, we'll meet those who were paid not to feel pain or absorb sin, but to display grief. Their job was to cry, and they were very, very good at it.
Oh, my heart! My heart!
In a time when death was ever present and deeply ritualized, grief became performance, and sometimes that performance was bought and paid for. Enter the professional mourner, a figure hired to cry, wail, and display visible sorrow at funerals, especially for the wealthy or influential. While grief is a deeply personal emotion, medieval society often demanded that it be expressed in public dramatic ways. A quiet funeral could be seen as shameful or disrespectful, especially if the deceased held a high social rank. So families who feared social judgment or simply wanted to magnify their mourning would turn to professionals who knew how to weep on command. These mourners, sometimes men, but more often women, were skilled at their craft. They dressed in black or grey, covered their heads, and positioned themselves near the front of funeral processions. At the appropriate moment, they would begin their lament, moaning, sobbing, beating their chests, or even throwing themselves to the ground. Some were known for their poetic laments, incorporating the name and deeds of the deceased into rhythmic chants. Others simply cried loudly and convincingly, filling the silence of grief with sound. Their job wasn't just noise, it was spectacle. Their tears validated the family's loss and gave the impression that the deceased had been truly beloved. The use of professional mourners had ancient roots stretching back to Egypt, Greece and Rome, but it persisted in various forms throughout the Middle Ages. In some Christian communities, church officials frowned upon the practice, calling it insincere or pagan. But in many rural or folk traditions, it was completely accepted, even expected. The bigger the funeral, the louder the grief. Mourners were sometimes paid in coins, bread ale, or fabric, depending on the family's means. Some worked regularly for noble households, while others travelled from village to village, making their living one funeral at a time. Despite their role in public rituals, professional mourners lived on the fringes of society. Their job forced them to hover between two worlds, the living and the dead. Too familiar with death to be fully welcomed among the living, yet not truly mourners themselves. People respected their role, but kept their distance, unsure whether to see them as performers, prophets, or parasites. Some believed they brought bad luck. Others whispered that mourners could curse a family with false grief, stealing peace from the dead if not paid properly. Even so, their presence remained a powerful symbol, an audible declaration of remembrance. In some cases, the performance of mourning became competitive. Noble families would outdo one another by hiring more mourners, ensuring a more dramatic display of sorrow. A powerful lord might have dozens of professional wailers at his funeral, their cries echoing across stone cathedrals or echoing down narrow streets. The louder the lament, the greater the legacy. And in this strange equation, grief became currency traded in volume, tone, and spectacle. Real or not, the performance helped the living let go, or at least appear as though they had. Today, the idea of hiring someone to cry at a funeral feels foreign, even uncomfortable. But in the medieval world, where death was familiar and grief was communal, professional mourners served a purpose. They gave shape to sorrow, voice to silence, and ritual to loss. Their tears may have been practiced, but the emotion they helped express was often very real. And as we move toward the final professions of this chapter, we turn now to those whose jobs were more mundane yet no less odd. In the next section, we meet the candle inspectors and ale tasters, medieval quality control specialists who made sure what you drank and lit wouldn't kill you. Not all strange medieval professions were soaked in filth or steeped in superstition. Some were surprisingly bureaucratic, even scientific in their own way. Among them were the ale tasters and candle viewers officials tasked with ensuring the quality of everyday essentials in an age before regulations, branding, or expiration dates. In a world where a spoiled batch of ale could sicken a village or a poorly made candle could cause a house fire, these odd jobs were not only respected, they were necessary. They formed a kind of medieval quality control long before anyone knew what a standard unit of measurement was. The ale taster was often elected by the town or appointed by a local guild, and their duty was simple in theory: to visit taverns and breweries, sample the ale and determine whether it was fit for sale. They checked for taste strength, clarity and ingredients, ensuring the brewer hadn't watered it down or used unsafe additives. But it wasn't just about flavour, it was about fairness and health. Ale was safer than water in many places, and it served as a staple drink for all ages. If the ale was too weak, too strong, or poorly made, the taster could issue fines or shut the cellar down. Some ale tasters took their role so seriously that they developed reputations as local celebrities, or in the brewer's eyes, dreaded inspectors. Similarly peculiar were the candle viewers officials who inspected candles to ensure they burned properly evenly and for the appropriate length of time. Candles were not only a source of light, but in many religious institutions they were timekeepers. A candle that burned too fast could disrupt prayers, ceremonies, or work shifts. In public spaces and churches, poor quality candles posed serious fire risks. The candle viewer would examine the composition, often beeswax or tallow, and measure burn rates using standardized tests. A dishonest candle maker who mixed in inferior fats might make more profit, but they'd risk punishment if their product failed inspection. These roles may seem quaint, even laughable today, but in their time they were integral to community function and safety. They reflect a surprising level of organization and attention to detail in medieval life, one that often goes unnoticed in grand stories of kings and crusades. Ale tasters and candle viewers didn't carry swords or wear robes, but they helped regulate daily life with quiet consistency. They kept corruption in check, upheld local pride, and ensured that when a man lit a candle or raised a mug, he got what he paid for and maybe a little peace of mind. As we reflect on these strange and often overlooked professions, from the bell ringer alone in his tower to the ale taster sipping through the shadows of a tavern, it becomes clear that medieval life was far more complex than the myths of chivalry and crusade suggest. These were real jobs held by real people performing tasks that society depended on, even if it preferred not to acknowledge them. Some laboured in filth, others in silence. All existed in that peculiar space between necessity and invisibility. Their presence maintained the daily rhythms of life, yet their names rarely made it into history books. What ties them all together is not just their oddity, but the way they were perceived. Many of these workers were treated with suspicion or outright disdain. The sin-eater was feared. The gong farmer was shunned. The leech collector was pitied and the whipping boy beaten but not blamed. These were not glamorous roles nor even respectable ones, and yet they carried out essential duties in a society that depended on function over fairness. The paradox of medieval life is that those who laboured the hardest were often those held in the lowest regard. Over time, many of these professions began to fade not because they became less important, but because the world around them changed. As plumbing advanced, the gong farmer disappeared. As timekeeping improved, the bell ringer gave way to the clock. As medical understanding evolved, the leech collector's craft turned obsolete. Others vanished more quietly, phased out by shifting beliefs, urban reforms, or simply forgotten as generations passed. Their tools rusted, their titles faded, and their stories were reduced to footnotes until now. In the next chapter, we'll explore the social consequences of these roles in greater depth. How did society justify relying on people it refused to respect? What did it mean to be seen as impure, cursed, or beneath dignity just for doing a job no one else would? And how did the weight of that perception follow these workers through life, and sometimes even into death? We'll also look at how changing technologies, religious doctrines, and cultural norms led many of these professions to vanish, sometimes overnight, sometimes over centuries. Because behind every strange medieval job lies a larger story of class, of belief, of survival. These weren't just odd careers, they were reflections of a world trying to stay afloat without machine science or sanitation. A world that depended on human bodies, human hands, and often human sacrifice. And though these jobs may be gone, their echoes remain whispered in alleyways, etched into old city walls, and buried in the same graveyards they once laboured to maintain.
Faith, sin, and loyal hands.
In the rigid social order of the Middle Ages, work was not only a means of survival, it was a reflection of spiritual and moral identity. Society divided labour not just by function, but by perceived purity. Some jobs were considered clean, honourable, even blessed. Others were labelled dirty both literally and spiritually, no matter how necessary they were. This wasn't merely about hygiene, it was about divine hierarchy. The idea that some types of work were noble, while others were degrading, shaped how people were treated, paid, remembered, or forgotten. At the top of the labour pyramid were the clergy, scribes, and those connected to the church. Their work involved books, rituals, and prayer activities untouched by blood soil or filth. Monks copied scripture in candlelit silence, priests conducted holy rites, and bishops made decisions that shaped kingdoms. Their hands stayed clean, and their minds were thought to be closer to heaven. Below them were administrators, merchants, and skilled craftsmen, those who created and controlled but rarely got their hands too dirty. These professions carried prestige and were often associated with intellect training and divine order. But for every man who rang a church bell or inked a manuscript, there were dozens who handled the parts of life most preferred to be unseen. The butcher, whose knife carved life into meat. The tanner, whose vats reeked of urine and decay. The executioner, whose blade brought both fear and finality. These were the dirty jobs tainted by death, bodily fluids, or proximity to decay. No matter how essential they were to society, those who performed them were often viewed with suspicion, avoided in public, and kept at the margins of communal life. Their labour sustained daily living, but their presence unsettled it. One of the clearest markers of a dirty profession was touch. To touch blood, to touch waste, to touch the dead, these acts stained more than the skin. In the eyes of many, they stained the soul. A midwife who delivered babies was respected in one breath, feared as a bringer of impurity in the next. A gravedigger ensured proper burial, but few would share a meal with him. The gong farmer removed the waste that no one else would dare approach yet was treated as less than human in the light of day. It was as if the moral filth of the task clung invisibly to the worker long after the job was done. This divide between clean and dirty extended beyond physical labour into spiritual judgment. Medieval Christians believed that suffering in one's earthly profession could affect one's place in the afterlife. Some saw lowly work as a path to humility, even sainthood, while others feared that contact with impurity made a person more susceptible to sin. The very same people who depended on butchers, barbers, or leech collectors would refuse to sit beside them in church pews. Status was drawn not just by wealth or title, but by the symbolic cleanliness of one's work. Interestingly, the boundary was not always clear. A blacksmith worked with fire and metal, dirty, dangerous work, but was often revered for his strength and skill. A baker's hands were covered in flour, not filth, and his product fed the town, earning him modest respect. But a hangman or a latrine cleaner, though fulfilling critical societal roles, was often cursed in the same breath as thanked. These professions existed in a moral grey zone, serving the community while being rejected by it. Their dirtiness wasn't just about the physical mess, it was about death shame and the reminder of humanity's frailty. The paradox of medieval labour is that the most visibly pure professions often did the least to maintain everyday life. It was the so-called dirty workers, those who cut, cleaned, buried and bled, that kept the wheels of society turning. Yet they were pushed to the edges, their contributions undervalued, their humanity overlooked. They were invisible by design, necessary but not to be celebrated. And this divide didn't just affect social interactions, it shaped laws, wages, and entire systems of inheritance and honour. In the next section, we'll look even deeper at how religious institutions helped reinforce these divisions. What did it mean when the church itself deemed a profession sinful? How did people cope with being essential to a society that considered their work impure? And how did these judgments ripple into the physical dangers and mental toll of everyday life? The world of medieval labour wasn't just about tools and tasks, it was about judgment, stigma, and the quiet endurance of those who bore society's burdens in silence. In medieval Europe, religion did more than shape belief, it defined the very structure of society, including how people worked, and more importantly, how they were judged for their work. The church was not merely a place of worship. It was the primary moral authority, and it had strong opinions about what kinds of labour were virtuous, tolerable, or downright sinful. A job was never just a job. It was a reflection of the worker's soul, a sign of one's alignment with God, or with temptation. This framework placed immense moral weight on people's livelihoods, casting some professions as spiritually worthy, and others as spiritually dangerous. Work that was associated with creation care or prayer was celebrated. Monks who copied scriptures, scribes who maintained holy records, or stonemasons who built cathedrals were often viewed as part of God's plan. Farmers and shepherds whose labour echoed biblical imagery were seen as humble but respectable. Even carpenters, like the trade attributed to Christ himself, carried a certain sacredness. But those whose work involved blood, death, or deception were regarded with suspicion. Executioners, prostitutes, gamblers, moneylenders, and even actors were seen as tainted professions that endangered not just the body but the soul. The line between honest work and sinful labour was sometimes thin and often influenced by superstition or church politics. Butchers, for example, were tolerated because their work was necessary for feeding the population, yet they were often required to live outside the town walls and were excluded from religious leadership roles. Barbers who doubled as surgeons and performed bloodletting were essential for medical care, but their contact with bodily fluids made them spiritually suspect in some circles. Midwives, though vital in childbirth, were frequently accused of witchcraft or consorting with the devil, especially if a child died during delivery. Some professions were outright banned by the church. Usury, the practice of charging interest on loans, was one of the most infamous examples. Moneylenders were often condemned as greedy, corrupt, and spiritually bankrupt. Despite this, moneylending continued often past to Jewish communities who were already marginalised and thus more vulnerable to blame and persecution. Actors and performers, too, were seen as morally questionable. Their ability to mimic others and stir emotion was viewed as deception, a temptation away from truth. Church councils occasionally banned theatrical performances during holy seasons, declaring them distractions from prayer and repentance. Even trades that dealt with death grave diggers, embalmers, or sin-eaters were necessary yet morally complex. The church relied on them but refused to honour them. These workers were typically denied burial in consecrated ground or excluded from communion. Their constant contact with corpses was thought to spiritually contaminate them regardless of their personal piety. This belief wasn't just symbolic, it had real consequences. It affected where people could live, who they could marry, and how they were remembered after death. A lifetime of service could end in social and spiritual isolation. Confession and repentance offered some relief, but for many their job was their fate. A person born into a family of butchers or grave workers might never escape the social stigma no matter how devout they were. The idea that one could be guilty not for what they believed but for what they did was deeply embedded in medieval theology. The church taught that salvation was possible for all but some professions, made that path steeper, lonelier, and less certain. The concept of honest labour was often reserved for those whose hands stayed clean not just of dirt but of moral ambiguity, and yet the church itself depended on these same workers. Monasteries needed bakers, cooks, and gardeners. Cathedrals had to be cleaned, repaired, and guarded. Pilgrims had to be fed and housed. There was a quiet hypocrisy in condemning certain kinds of labour while reaping their benefits. This tension played out in sermons, confessions, and silent acts of endurance. Many workers turned to personal faith-folk traditions or local saints to find dignity in what the church would not give them. They prayed not for status, but for forgiveness, strength, and understanding. What emerges from all this is a medieval world where work was more than physical. It was moral, symbolic, and heavily policed. A man might toil his whole life for the good of his town, only to be judged unworthy by the very faith that structured that town's values. A woman might heal dozens through herbal remedies yet be called a witch if her timing was wrong. These judgments didn't disappear with death, they followed people into memory, into burial, and into the records written by monks who never touched a plough or a blade. In the next section, we'll move from spiritual judgment to physical consequence. Because some jobs didn't just damage reputations, they damaged bodies. We'll explore how dangerous many of these strange professions truly were, and how the risks, both visible and invisible, left lasting scars on the people who performed them. In the medieval world, work didn't just define your status, it shaped your body. For many, especially those in medicine and sanitation, the toll of their labour was slow, invisible, and inescapable. There were no gloves, no masks, no antiseptics. A surgeon or a barber might spend their life covered in blood, never understanding why infection spread from one patient to the next. A midwife could lose her own life to postpartum fever caught during birth. A gravedigger could fall ill from handling corpses during a plague and be buried in the same ground he once tended. Pain and risk were woven into the fabric of these professions. Barber surgeons who doubled as both medical practitioners and personal groomers performed everything from tooth extractions to amputations, often with unwashed hands and rusty blades. They inhaled the stench of open wounds and rotting flesh daily. Bloodletting, one of the most common procedures, was messy, imprecise, and dangerous for both patient and practitioner. The risk of disease transmission was high but poorly understood. Many barbers suffered from infected cuts, festering wounds, or long-term exposure to sick patients. They were not shielded by knowledge, only driven by experience and demand. Their bravery lay not just in what they did, but in how often they did it without protection or praise. Sanitation workers faced even worse. Gong farmers tasked with cleaning cesspits breathed in clouds of methane, ammonia, and bacteria every night. Some collapsed from toxic fumes. Others drowned in the very waste they tried to remove. Their skin cracked, their lungs weakened, and their joints ached from the relentless labour. They worked while others slept in tunnels and pits beneath cities that depended on them, yet offered no safety. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera circulated through their ranks long before anyone understood how they spread. They were walking proof that essential work could also be deadly. Even in the quieter spaces of care like apothecaries, herbalists, or leech collectors, danger was present. Herbalists exposed themselves to poisonous plants, often absorbing toxins through their skin. Leech collectors wading into swamps suffered repeated blood loss infections and skin disorders. Without clean water or proper treatment, even a small cut could turn fatal. Respiratory illnesses from damp conditions, skin diseases from parasites, and broken bones from accidents were common and largely untreated. These workers were at the mercy of their environments with no relief or compensation if their bodies gave out. Illness was not just a risk, it was inevitable. What made these health risks even more tragic was the social perception attached to them. The more dangerous and unpleasant a job was, the more likely its worker was to be socially marginalised. A person could suffer daily for the sake of public health or survival, and still be seen as morally impure or less than human. There were no medals, no pensions, no healing retreats. The labourers endured until they couldn't, and when their bodies broke, they were replaced by someone younger, cheaper, or more desperate. This cycle was accepted as part of life. Pain was not an anomaly, it was an expectation. In the next section, we'll look at how some of these roles slowly disappeared, not because they became less important, but because the world changed around them. Advances in plumbing medicine and social values didn't just make certain jobs obsolete, they erased entire classes of invisible workers from history. As the centuries passed, many of these strange and stigmatized professions began to fade not with celebration, but with silence. The world shifted. Science advanced, cities modernized, and the very needs that once gave birth to these jobs slowly disappeared. Running water reduced the need for gong farmers. Accurate clocks replaced the bell ringer's lonely vigil. The invention of antiseptics and sterilization protocols made bloodletting obsolete, and with each invention, with each reform, an entire way of life was quietly erased. But these professions didn't vanish because they were meaningless. They vanished because the world evolved around them, technologies replaced them, attitudes changed, and systems became more efficient, more sanitary, more humane. Some workers were relieved to see their children escape the hardship they endured. Others resisted, clinging to their trade even as society moved on. Many left no records, no graves, no names, just faded laws, forgotten tools, and cryptic job titles in medieval manuscripts. Their absence tells us as much about progress as their presence once did. In the next chapter, we'll trace the disappearance of these forgotten professions. We'll ask what happens when a job once essential is no longer needed. Where do its people go? What do we lose when an entire profession slips into myth? And are there echoes of these roles, these rat catchers, bell ringers, and sin eaters still present in the world we live in today? Some of them may be gone, but perhaps not entirely.
All gone, yet time remembers.
Technology doesn't always announce its arrival with thunder. Sometimes it enters quietly, one invention, one tool, one small change, and entire professions dissolve in its wake. In the medieval world, even the simplest innovation could completely transform labour. The printing press turned scribes into relics, the flush toilet buried the gong farmer, clocks silenced bell ringers, and with each advance a piece of the human machinery that once ran the world was dismantled not through cruelty but through progress. One of the most profound casualties of medieval innovation was the scribe, the skilled individual who copied books by hand one letter at a time. Before Gutenberg's press revolutionized Europe, monks and scribes were the keepers of knowledge, spending years transcribing Bible's law codes and medical texts. Their work was sacred, meticulous, and painfully slow. But once movable type arrived, books could be printed by the hundreds in days instead of months. Demand for hand-copied manuscripts plummeted. The cloisters fell silent, and many scribes once revered were forced to abandon the only profession they had ever known. Similarly, the rise of public sanitation systems in growing urban centres brought an end to one of the filthiest yet most necessary jobs of the age, the gong farmer. As cities installed drainage channels, brick sewers, and eventually flush toilets, the need for men to haul human waste from cesspits by hand began to disappear. In places like London, this transition took decades, but it was unstoppable. Innovations in water flow, gravity-fed plumbing, and underground infrastructure did what no law or social shame could achieve. They made the gong farmer irrelevant. By the 18th century, few remembered the men who once worked in darkness, so others could live in the light. The role of the bell ringer was also reshaped by machines. Mechanical clocks first appeared in church towers and monasteries in the 14th century, gradually replacing the need for human timekeepers. These early devices struck bells on the hour with astonishing regularity regardless of weather fatigue or personal failure. While some bell ringers continued as caretakers of the tower, or ceremonial ringers for special occasions, their monopoly on timekeeping was gone. Once a symbol of communal rhythm, the bell rope passed into the hands of gears and springs. Even in medicine, technology slowly eroded the need for traditional practices. The Leech collector, for instance, vanished not because leeches disappeared, but because medical understanding advanced beyond humoral theory. As doctors embraced germ theory microscopes and chemical treatments, the idea of balancing blood through parasitic worms lost its grip. Apothecaries stopped ordering live leeches in bulk, and the muddy ponds once trampled by desperate collectors grew still. What had once been a stable if grim career became a curious footnote in the history of healing. It's important to remember that the loss of these professions was not just about economic change, it was about identity. For generations, people defined themselves by their craft. A man whose father and grandfather were scribes might feel spiritually dislocated in a world where books came from machines. A family of waste handlers once feared and needed might vanish into poverty when the city no longer required their services. These were more than jobs, they were entire ecosystems of skill, risk, knowledge and culture. And when the ecosystem collapsed, it left human fallout in its place. Still, for all the disruption, this process was also part of something larger. The disappearance of these professions marked the beginning of a new kind of society, one driven by systems rather than individuals. Where once a bell ringer's muscle marked the hour a gear now ticked. Where once a monk's quill carried the words of saints, a press now thundered. The result was more efficient, more scalable, and arguably more just, but also more distant, less personal. The human touch was replaced by the mechanical hum. In the next section, we'll explore another kind of disappearance, not from machines, but from the tides of war plague and politics. Because not all jobs vanish through invention. Some are swept away in storms of history, gone not because they failed, but because the world around them collapsed. Not all professions vanish because of progress. Some disappear in the smoke of war, in the silence of plague, or under the weight of collapsing kingdoms. In the Middle Ages, entire trades were wiped out not by invention but by catastrophe. Armies marched, cities burned, and diseases swept through villages with no warning. With them, they took not only lives but the labour structures that had kept communities running. In many cases, the work itself was never replaced because the world that needed it no longer existed. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, didn't just kill millions, it dismantled economies overnight. So many people died that basic trades collapsed from sheer lack of labour. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. Clothmakers, bakers, butchers, and porters vanished in waves. In some areas, entire guilds ceased to function, their masters and apprentices buried in mass graves. Certain niche professions like charm sellers, plague wardens, or corpse watchers briefly rose in prominence only to vanish again when the disease receded. The world they served was temporary born in panic, extinguished in recovery. War too had the power to erase professions. Long-standing trades could be crushed under the boots of invading armies. When castles were destroyed, the masons and stonelayers who specialised in fortification work lost their purpose. When monasteries were dissolved or burned, scribes, herbalists and caretakers tied to those sacred spaces were displaced. Entire regions depopulated by raids or scorched earth campaigns could no longer support tanners, millers or local tax collectors. Even those who survived often fled their homes, abandoning their tools and trade in search of safety. The map changed, and with it the labour that had once defined a region. Political upheaval had similar effects. When rulers were overthrown, their courts disbanded and their servants dismissed. Royal falconers, court jesters, wardrobe keepers, occupations tied intimately to the prestige of a single household could disappear in an instant. In the wake of revolution or dynastic collapse, what once seemed noble could become dangerous. Those who once polished crowns or brewed for queens might find themselves hunted, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The profession itself became a liability, and with no one left to perform it safely, it faded into obscurity. Religious shifts also dismantled entire categories of labour. The Protestant Reformation, for example, closed down monasteries across much of Europe. With them went the brewers, scribes, candle makers, and bell ringers, whose lives revolved around monastic life. Pilgrimage shrines were emptied, leaving behind vendors, healers, and innkeepers who had thrived on the foot traffic of the faithful. Suddenly, jobs tied to relics and rituals were branded superstitious or heretical. Overnight, pious professions became dangerous ones. The workforce had not changed, but the ideology had, and that alone was enough to wipe out generations of inherited skill. In some cases, entire professions were wiped out because they were associated with the losing side. During the 100 Years' War, certain local officials like French tax enforcers or English scribes were executed or expelled when territories changed hands. Their roles were viewed not as neutral but as political. To be a profession linked to the wrong authority was to invite suspicion. The job disappeared not because it was useless, but because it became too dangerous to perform. In this way, war and politics didn't just kill people, they killed tradescrafts and traditions. What these stories reveal is that labour in the medieval world was incredibly vulnerable to the tides of history. A craftsman might spend decades honing a skill that became worthless overnight. A healer might lose her patience to plague and her practice to reform. These were not evolutionary losses, they were erasures, sudden, brutal, and often absolute, and in the wreckage communities had to rebuild not just homes and churches, but the very labour networks that had once sustained them. In the final section of this chapter, we'll look at the echo of these lost professions today. What fragments remain? Are some of these jobs still hiding in modern form, disguised by new names and tools? Progress may have moved on, but history leaves traces even in the most ordinary tasks. Though the titles have changed and the tools have evolved, many of the strange medieval jobs we've explored still survive in new forms today. The gong farmer, once waist-deep in human waste, has become the modern sanitation worker, still responsible for what others flush and forget. Instead of working in darkness with buckets, they now operate vacuum trucks, wear protective gear, and are part of public health systems. What was once a dangerous, reviled task is now a regulated and respected profession, though the labour remains just as essential to society's daily rhythm. The scribe who once spent years copying a single manuscript by candlelight finds a strange descendant in today's data entry clerk typist, or even code editor. Where scribes preserved knowledge through ink and vellum, modern workers manage information through keyboards and screens. The pace is faster, the tools more efficient, but the job still centres on the careful recording and transmission of words and meaning. Similarly, the town crier, whose voice echoed through medieval markets with news and proclamations, has become the journalist broadcaster, or even social media manager, disseminating public messages in ways that reach far more people, but still depend on trust and timing. Other roles have shifted more symbolically. The sin eater once paid to absorb a dead person's guilt now echoes in the quiet work of therapists, grief counsellors, or spiritual care providers, people who help carry emotional burdens rather than ritual ones. Professional mourners hired to cry aloud in funerals have faded, but their spirit lingers in funeral directors and ceremonial speakers who give shape to grief through words and presence. These modern forms are cleaner, quieter, and more discreet, but at their core they continue the ancient work of helping others navigate the most human moments of life and death. What we call progress is often just transformation. The strangest jobs of the past didn't disappear, they changed clothes. We've journeyed through the forgotten corners of medieval life where survival wasn't won on the battlefield or at court, but in back alleys, muddy fields, cold towers, and flickering candlelight. We met the rat catchers and mouse watchers, men who stayed up through the night to keep rodents from spreading disease and devouring precious food stores. We descended with the gong farmers who hauled human waste from the depths of medieval cities, and stood ankle-deep in swamps with leech collectors who bled for the sake of someone else's healing. We sat beside the dead with sin-eaters who took on the spiritual burdens of strangers and stood beside bell ringers who marked time and drove off unseen dangers with each toll. We visited the strange logic of royalty where whipping boys were punished in place of untouchable princes, and joined professional mourners hired to cry loudly enough to impress the living and honour the dead. We watched ale tasters test for purity, and candle viewers ensure sacred flames burned evenly. guardians of quality long before regulations ever existed, and we met the resurrectionist men who dug in silence under moonlight to feed the hunger of medical knowledge, risking prison and fury to deliver cadavers to anatomy tables. Every one of these professions filled a gap between need and fear, between progress and ignorance, between ritual and reality. They were often invisible, sometimes reviled and rarely celebrated. Yet they kept the medieval world running quietly, persistently, and at great personal cost. Some vanished with time, others transformed into the modern roles we know today. But all of them, in their own way, reflected something deeply human, the will to find purpose, even in the strangest of places. So now that you've seen them, heard their stories, ask yourself again, would you take these jobs? Or maybe, do we already have? Now that you've walked through the alleys and shadows of medieval labour, here's the question we leave you with. Which of these jobs would you dare to choose? Would you rather ring bells in a freezing tower at dawn, or wade barefoot through marshes to collect blood-hungry leeches? Would you face the judgment of a town as a sin-eater, or the stench and danger of a cesspit as a gong farmer? Would you suffer beatings on behalf of a royal child, or eat food placed on the chest of the dead in hope of saving their soul? None of these choices are easy, but that's exactly what makes the question so revealing. There is no safe answer, only the one that speaks to how you understand purpose, fear and dignity. Do you value solitude? Then maybe you'd choose the bell tower. Are you drawn to ritual and symbolism? The sin-eater might be your path. Do you want to serve quietly in the background, keeping life moving for everyone else, unseen but vital? Then the sanitation workers and candle watchers would welcome you. And if your answer is none, then consider how many people even today take on modern versions of these roles without choice, without thanks, and without recognition. So tell us which job would you choose and why. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Because history doesn't just ask us to observe, it dares us to imagine ourselves in it. And in doing so, we come closer to understanding the strange, gritty, and very human truth beneath it all. If you thought these jobs were strange, wait until you meet the people who built cathedrals with bare hands, carved secrets into stone, or sold silk across 3 kingdoms without knowing how to read. In our next episode, we'll step into the world of craftsmen and merchants, the builders, makers, and deal brokers of the medieval economy. These were the blacksmiths who forged not only weapons but reputations, the cobblers whose shoes touched every muddy road in Europe, the merchants who risked pirates' plagues and politics to move spices and wool across borders. Their work was more than skill, it was strategy, survival, and ambition. Some were guild-trained masters, others were streetwise traders rewriting the rules from the market stalls up. So if you've ever wondered how a barrel maker held more power than a knight, or how a cloth merchant might outsmart a noble at court, don't miss what's coming next. The strange world of medieval labour isn't done with us yet. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the forgotten, filthy, and fascinating jobs of the medieval world. If one of these roles sparked your imagination, or made you shudder, let us know in the comments. Which job would you choose and which would you never touch, no matter the pay? If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our exploration of medieval life. Until then, stay curious and remember, history is often stranger than fiction.
To good health and a fine harvest.
Hey, to that. And to full bellies.